The morning of June 18, 1944, on the island of Saipan. A Japanese Zero fighter from Guam came in low over Aslito Airfield, its pilot preparing to land. He saw the familiar runway below, the coral surface still pocked with shell craters. What he did not see, could not have known until the moment his wheels touched down, was that the men waiting for him were American. Machine gun fire tore through the Zero's fuselage as it skidded across the airstrip. The pilot survived long enough to understand his mistake. The airfield he had thought was still Japanese had changed hands just hours earlier. And in less than 48 hours from that moment, that same runway would be operational again, launching American fighters against targets the pilot's commanders had believed were safe. The Japanese had built Aslito Airfield knowing what it represented. From this single runway on the southern tip of Saipan, their aircraft could patrol the sea lanes to Australia. They could intercept American bombers. They could provide early warning of any threat approaching the home islands, just 1,500 miles to the north. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had poured resources into this facility since 1937. They had violated international law to do it, constructing military infrastructure in territory the League of Nations had forbidden them from fortifying. By June of 1944, Aslito was more than an airfield. It was a symbol of Japanese control over the Central Pacific. It was proof that the Empire's defensive perimeter still held. And on the morning of June 15, when American Marines waded ashore on Saipan's western beaches, every Japanese commander understood what would happen if that airfield fell. The Americans understood it too. Admiral Chester Nimitz had made the Marianas Islands the next objective in the Pacific War for one simple reason: distance. Saipan sat 1,500 miles from Tokyo, exactly within range of the new B-29 Superfortress bomber. Take Saipan, and you could strike the Japanese homeland directly. Take Aslito Airfield, and you could base the fighters and bombers that would shorten the war by months, perhaps years. But taking the airfield was only the beginning. Making it operational was another matter entirely. The Japanese defenders knew this. On June 16, as American forces pushed inland from the invasion beaches, Japanese artillery units received orders to concentrate their fire on one target. Not the beaches where thousands of Marines were still landing. Not the supply dumps being established behind the front lines. The Japanese fired on Aslito Airfield itself. They poured shells onto the runway, cratering the coral surface, destroying the drainage systems, wrecking everything they had built over 7 years of occupation. If they could not hold Aslito, they would make certain the Americans could not use it. Or so they believed. What the Japanese commanders did not account for was the existence of a military unit that had not existed 3 years earlier. A force that combined the expertise of civilian construction workers with the discipline of Marine Corps training. A group of men whose average age was 37, far older than the teenagers filling out most infantry companies. The United States Naval Construction Battalions. The Seabees. The men of the 121st Naval Construction Battalion had landed on Saipan's blue beaches on June 15, wearing Marine uniforms, carrying rifles alongside their surveying equipment and bulldozer parts. They came ashore with the 4th Marine Division in the first wave of the assault. 10 Seabees died that first day. 6 to 9 were wounded. But they kept moving inland, following the Marines toward the objective everyone knew mattered most. Aslito Airfield fell on June 18. The 27th Infantry Division secured it after 3 days of fighting that left the runway surface looking like the moon. Shell craters overlapped. Shrapnel littered the coral. The drainage ditches that kept the airstrip usable during the rainy season had collapsed. Japanese engineers had done their work well. The airfield looked unusable. The official assessment from Marine Corps Command was cautious. Repair the field. Make it operational. Timeline: several weeks, perhaps a month. The 121st Battalion looked at the same runway and saw something different. They saw materials. Coral stockpiles the Japanese had left near the field's edge. They saw equipment. 2 Japanese road rollers, damaged but repairable. They saw a problem that could be solved not in weeks but in days, if you had men who knew what they were doing. And the Seabees knew exactly what they were doing. The battalion had been formed in 1942 from men recruited specifically for their construction experience. Carpenters, heavy equipment operators, steelworkers, surveyors, electricians, plumbers. These were not 18-year-old farm boys learning how to dig a foxhole. These were professionals who had built roads and buildings and infrastructure across America during peacetime. The Navy had simply put them in uniform, trained them to fight, and sent them to the Pacific to build the bases that would win the war. The Seabees' reputation had been growing since Guadalcanal, where they had kept Henderson Field operational under daily Japanese bombardment. They had carved a 6,000-foot airstrip out of virgin jungle at Espiritu Santo in just 20 days. They had built everything from hospitals to fuel depots to pontoon causeways, often while under fire. But Saipan would be different. Saipan would be watched. The Central Pacific offensive depended on the Marianas. Nimitz had staked his strategy on capturing these islands and turning them into bases for the final assault on Japan. If the Seabees could not make Aslito operational quickly, the entire timeline would slip. The Marines on Saipan would lack close air support. The Japanese garrison would have more time to reorganize. The invasion of the next island, Tinian, would be delayed. Every day mattered. Every hour mattered. On the morning of June 19th, 3 companies of the 121st Battalion began work on the northern side of Aslito's runway. They chose the northern section because the Japanese bombardment had been less concentrated there. The southern approach was completely destroyed. The northern strip could be saved, but only if they worked fast. The men started by filling craters. They used coral from the stockpiles the Japanese had left behind, shoveling it into shell holes, tamping it down, leveling it. This was not delicate work. This was brute force engineering, the kind of construction that separates theory from practice. You could not bring in precision equipment. You could not wait for ideal conditions. You had the men, the materials, and the mission. Everything else was improvisation. The 2 Japanese road rollers became critical. Seabee mechanics examined them, found them damaged but functional, and got them running. Within hours, these enemy machines were compacting American-placed coral on an airstrip that would soon launch American aircraft against Japanese positions. The irony was not lost on anyone. By the end of the first day, the northern runway section showed progress, but it was not ready. The coral had been placed, but it needed time to settle, to compact, to harden into a surface that could support the weight of fighter aircraft traveling at takeoff speed. The Marines were still fighting less than a mile away. Artillery fire could be heard constantly. Snipers remained active throughout the area. And the Seabees kept working. They worked through the night of June 19th. They worked through the day of June 20th. They filled craters, laid coral, rolled it flat, checked their levels, adjusted, repeated. This was construction under combat conditions, the most demanding work any engineer could face. And on June 21st, just 3 days after the airfield's capture, 2 days after repairs began, the Seabees declared the northern runway operational. The first aircraft to land was a Navy patrol bomber, testing the surface. It touched down, rolled to a stop, and confirmed what the Seabees already knew. The runway held. That same day, June 21st, the entire strip, 150 feet wide by 4,500 feet long, was cleared for operations. And on June 23rd, just 5 days after its capture, P-47 Thunderbolts of the 19th Fighter Squadron landed at Aslito Airfield from the escort carriers Manila Bay and Natoma Bay. The fighters were immediately fitted with launching racks for rockets. Hours later, they delivered a rocket strike on Japanese positions on nearby Tinian Island. The Marines on Saipan now had close air support. The Japanese defenders now faced American aircraft operating from the very base they had built to defend against American attack. And in Tokyo, in Rabaul, in every Japanese command post across the Pacific, officers looked at intelligence reports and asked the same question. How? How had the Americans made Aslito operational in 2 days? The Japanese had expected weeks of delay. They had counted on that delay. Their defense of Saipan, their plans for counterattacking the American beachhead, their entire strategy for the Marianas campaign had assumed the Americans would need time, significant time, to repair the airfield. Instead, American fighters were in the air less than a week after the invasion began. The Japanese understanding of American engineering capability had been fundamentally wrong. What they failed to comprehend was not a difference in equipment or materials. The Japanese were excellent engineers. Aslito itself proved that. What they failed to comprehend was a difference in philosophy, in organization, in the very concept of what military construction could achieve. The Imperial Japanese military treated engineering as a secondary concern. Engineers were support personnel, lower status than infantry or armor or artillery. Construction took time because construction was not the priority. The American military, by contrast, had made construction a weapon. Admiral Ben Meriel, the creator of the Seabees, had understood from the beginning that modern war was as much about logistics as combat. You could have the best soldiers, the finest aircraft, the most powerful ships. But if you could not build the bases to support them, you would lose. The Seabees embodied that understanding. They were combat engineers in the truest sense. They could fight when necessary, their marine training ensured that. But their real power was their ability to build anything, anywhere, under any conditions. And they could do it at a speed that seemed impossible to observers from every other military in the world. The Japanese were not the only ones surprised. British officers, monitoring the Pacific campaign, took note of the Seabees' work at Saipan. They had their own Royal Engineers, highly trained and highly effective. But the scale and speed of American construction operations exceeded anything in British experience. After the war, British military analysts would study Seabee tactics, trying to understand how a unit formed only 3 years earlier had become so devastatingly effective. Part of the answer was recruitment. The Seabees had taken America's construction industry and put it in uniform. These were not men being trained from scratch. These were professionals with decades of combined experience, men who had built the roads and bridges and buildings of Depression-era America. They knew their trade. The military gave them discipline, organization, and purpose. Part of the answer was equipment. The Seabees had access to the most advanced construction machinery in the world, built by American factories working at peak capacity. Bulldozers, graders, rollers, asphalt plants, prefabricated structures. Everything needed to build a base was designed to be transported, assembled, and operated in combat zones. The equipment was standardized, which meant parts were interchangeable. It was robust, designed to function under harsh conditions. And it was abundant. American industrial production dwarfed anything the Axis powers could match. But equipment and expertise were only part of the story. The real secret of the Seabees' success was their mindset. They approached every problem as solvable. Crater-filled runway? Fill the craters. Damaged Japanese equipment? Fix it. Impossible deadline? Meet it anyway. This was not blind optimism. This was professional confidence born from experience. These men had solved construction problems their entire working lives. They had figured out how to build during the Depression when money was scarce and materials were limited. They had learned to improvise, to adapt, to make do with what was available. War simply added urgency to skills they already possessed. The Japanese commanders on Saipan, watching American fighters take off from Aslito just days after losing the airfield, faced a reality that contradicted everything their training had taught them. The Americans were supposed to be soft, dependent on overwhelming material advantage, unable to function when things went wrong. Instead, the Americans had demonstrated exactly the opposite. When confronted with a destroyed airfield, they had rebuilt it in 2 days, using Japanese equipment and materials, working under fire, achieving a timeline that seemed physically impossible. This was not a fluke. This was a pattern. Across the Pacific, on island after island, the Seabees were rewriting the rules of military engineering. At Tarawa in the Gilberts, they had made a shell-pocked airfield operational in just 15 hours. At Espiritu Santo, they had carved that 6,000-foot strip from jungle in 20 days. Later, on Tinian, they would build the largest airport in the world, 4 8,500-foot runways capable of handling 1,000 B-29s, in less than a year. These were not isolated achievements. These were the results of a systematic approach to construction that treated speed as essential rather than desirable. Every Seabee battalion was organized the same way. 4 companies of construction specialists, plus a headquarters company with medical personnel, storekeepers, and administrative staff. Each battalion could function independently, which meant they could be deployed wherever needed without waiting for support. Each battalion had its own equipment, which meant they did not depend on centralized supply depots that might be disrupted by combat. And each battalion was trained to improvise, to solve problems in the field rather than wait for orders from higher command. This organizational structure made the Seabees incredibly flexible. They could split into smaller detachments for multiple projects, or combine into larger brigades for massive undertakings. They could shift from one task to another without losing effectiveness. They were, in essence, a construction force designed for war, capable of operating at a pace that peacetime construction could never match. The impact of this capability extended far beyond individual projects. The Seabees' speed determined the tempo of the entire Pacific campaign. When Admiral Nimitz planned his island-hopping strategy, he calculated timelines based on how quickly the Seabees could make captured bases operational. When General Douglas MacArthur executed his Southwest Pacific offensive, he relied on Seabee battalions to build the infrastructure that kept his forces supplied and supported. The Seabees did not just build bases. They enabled offensive operations that would have been impossible without them. They were, as MacArthur himself said, one of the reasons the war in the Pacific could be fought at all. This was an air and amphibious war, MacArthur told the Chief of Engineers in 1944, and because of the nature of those operations, it was distinctly an engineers' war. He understood what many others did not. Victory in the Pacific would not come from simply defeating the Japanese in battle. Victory would come from building the logistics network that made sustained offensive operations possible. And that network had to be built at extraordinary speed, often under fire, in the most inhospitable conditions imaginable. On Saipan, as the 121st Battalion finished their work on Aslito Airfield, they did not pause to celebrate. They had already moved on to the next project, building warehouses, repairing roads, constructing fuel storage facilities. There was always more work. There was always the next island. But in the moment when those P-47s took off from Aslito on June 23, something fundamental had been demonstrated. The Americans could not only take territory from the Japanese. They could transform that territory faster than the Japanese could respond. This was not just military superiority. This was a different kind of warfare altogether. One built on the foundation of construction speed that seemed impossible until it was achieved. And the men who made it possible were not the generals planning the campaigns or the Marines storming the beaches. They were the 37-year-old mechanics and carpenters and bulldozer operators who had volunteered for a war they could have avoided, who had crossed an ocean to build the infrastructure that would bring that war to an end. They were the Seabees. And they had just shown the Japanese what American engineering really meant. The speed demonstrated at Aslito was not an isolated achievement. It was doctrine made real. The Seabees had developed construction methodologies specifically designed for combat conditions, approaches that civilian contractors would have considered reckless but that proved essential in the Pacific. Their philosophy was simple. Build fast, build functional, worry about perfection later. A runway did not need to be smooth as glass. It needed to support aircraft weight and provide adequate length for takeoff and landing. Everything else was secondary. This approach horrified traditionalists. Army Corps of Engineers officers, trained in meticulous standards, sometimes clashed with Seabee commanders who prioritized speed over specifications. But the results spoke for themselves. The Seabees could build in days what conventional approaches required weeks to complete. And in the Pacific, time was the scarcest resource. Every day an airfield remained non-operational was a day without air support, a day of vulnerability, a day the enemy could use to regroup. The Japanese had learned this lesson painfully during their own expansion across Asia and the Pacific in 1941 and 1942. Their initial conquests had been lightning fast, but their ability to consolidate and fortify captured territory had been slower. The Americans reversed this dynamic entirely. They took territory slowly, fighting for every yard, but once taken, that territory was transformed with astonishing speed into a fortress capable of supporting the next offensive. This operational tempo, this ability to compress the timeline between conquest and exploitation, gave American forces a decisive advantage. The Japanese could not match it. They lacked the industrial base, the equipment, the organizational structure, and perhaps most importantly, the cultural mindset that made Seabee-style construction possible. Japanese military culture emphasized careful planning and rigid adherence to established procedures. The Seabees embodied improvisation. They made decisions in the field, adapted to circumstances as they changed, and prioritized results over process. This difference in approach manifested in countless ways across the Pacific theater. When the Seabees moved to Tinian in late July 1944, just days after that island's capture, they faced an even more ambitious project than Aslito. Tinian would not just be another airfield. It would become the largest airport in the world. The initial objective was Ushi Point Airfield, a Japanese facility on the northern tip of the island. The 121st Battalion began repairs on July 27, filling bomb and shell craters just as they had done on Saipan. By evening on that same day, an airstrip 2,500 feet long and 150 feet wide was ready for use. By the next day, the strip was fully restored to its original 400 to 700 foot length. On July 29, a P-47 landed and took off successfully. The runway was operational. But Ushi Point was just the beginning. The real work would be constructing Northfield and Westfield, massive facilities capable of supporting hundreds of B-29 Superfortress bombers. These would be the bases from which the final air campaign against Japan would be launched. The construction plan was audacious. 4 parallel runways at Northfield, each 8,500 feet long. 2 more at Westfield. Taxiways connecting everything. Hardstands for hundreds of aircraft. Fuel storage facilities. Maintenance buildings. Housing for 40,000 personnel. The amount of material required was staggering. The Seabees would need to move coral equivalent to 3 times the volume of Hoover Dam. They would need to do it in less than a year. They did it in less than a year. By May 1945, Northfield's 4th runway was complete. The facility was fully operational, the largest airport in the world, built from jungle and coral by men working under combat conditions. The achievement seems impossible until you understand the scale of the effort. 15,000 Seabees worked on Tinian. Multiple battalions rotated through, each contributing expertise in different areas. Heavy equipment operated 24 hours a day. Coral was blasted from quarries, crushed, transported, spread, compacted, repeated endlessly until the runways were finished. The work was dangerous. Equipment malfunctions killed men. Heat stroke hospitalized dozens. Japanese holdouts occasionally fired on work parties, forcing the Seabees to return fire before resuming construction. But the work continued. The Seabees had learned a fundamental truth about warfare in the Pacific. You could not wait for perfect conditions. You could not pause construction because of enemy action. You built through the problems, solved them as they arose, and kept moving forward. This mindset was foreign to Japanese military thinking. Japanese construction doctrine emphasized thorough preparation, detailed planning, and careful execution. These were not bad principles. They produced excellent results in peacetime. But war was not peacetime. War demanded speed, flexibility, and a willingness to accept imperfection in pursuit of operational advantage. The Japanese had built Aslito Airfield over 7 years. The Americans made it operational in 2 days and then used it to attack the next island. The Japanese had built Ushi Point carefully, with proper drainage and solid foundations. The Americans repaired it in 1 day and then built 6 more runways that dwarfed anything the Japanese had attempted. The disparity in construction speed translated directly into military advantage. Every day an American airfield became operational earlier than expected was a day of air superiority gained. Every bomber that could take off from Tinian instead of having to fly from distant bases was a bomber that could carry more ordnance and spend more time over target. The strategic implications were profound. By early 1945, American B-29s based on Tinian, Saipan, and Guam were conducting daily raids on Japan. They bombed industrial facilities, transportation networks, and urban centers. They dropped mines in harbors, strangling Japanese shipping. They demonstrated to the Japanese population that their military could no longer protect them. This campaign was made possible by the Seabees' construction speed. Without Northfield and Westfield operational by February 1945, the bombing campaign would have been delayed by months. That delay would have extended the war, cost thousands of additional lives, and potentially changed the strategic calculations surrounding the atomic bombs dropped in August. The two B-29s that carried those weapons, Enola Gay and Boxcar, took off from runways built by the Seabees on Tinian. The bombs themselves were loaded in special pits constructed specifically for that purpose, designed by Seabee engineers who did not know what they were building but built it to exact specifications anyway. The atomic missions were the culmination of Seabee work that had begun with that first day on Saipan, filling craters at Aslito Airfield while Marines fought less than a mile away. Everything connected. Every runway, every taxiway, every fuel line contributed to a logistics network that brought overwhelming force to bear on Japan. And that network was built at a speed the Japanese could not match or counter. Japanese prisoners captured on Saipan and Tinian provided intelligence officers with insights into how the enemy viewed American construction capabilities. The reports were consistent. The prisoners expressed disbelief at the speed of American work. They could not understand how runways appeared so quickly. Some suspected that the Americans had prefabricated runway sections, that they were simply laying down prepared materials rather than building from scratch. This was not true. The Seabees were building everything on site, using local materials whenever possible, importing only what could not be sourced locally. But the speed was so far beyond Japanese experience that even witnessing it firsthand, they struggled to believe it was real. This disbelief extended to Japanese commanders. Intelligence intercepts revealed that Japanese headquarters routinely underestimated how quickly American bases would become operational. They planned defensive operations based on timelines that assumed weeks or months of American construction work. Then American aircraft appeared days after an airfield's capture, and Japanese plans collapsed. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. The Japanese military entered the Pacific War believing in their own superiority. They had defeated China. They had humiliated European colonial powers in Southeast Asia. They had struck Pearl Harbor and crippled the American Pacific Fleet. But as the war progressed, that confidence eroded. The Americans kept coming. They kept building. They kept attacking. And nothing the Japanese did seemed to slow them down. At Aslito Airfield on June 23, 1944, when those P-47s took off to strike Tinian, Japanese observers on Tinian watched through binoculars. They saw American fighters operating from a base that should still have been a crater-filled ruin. They reported what they saw to their commanders. And somewhere in that chain of command, someone understood what it meant. The Americans were not just winning battles. They were winning the war of logistics, the war of construction, the war of industrial capacity. They were demonstrating that Japan's defensive strategy, based on making every island so costly to capture that America would negotiate peace, was fundamentally flawed. Because even when the Americans paid a high price to take an island, they transformed it so quickly into a base for the next operation that the defensive victory became meaningless. This realization spread through Japanese ranks during the summer of 1944. Officers who had believed in ultimate victory began to doubt. Soldiers who had been told that American forces were soft and undisciplined saw evidence to the contrary every day. And the men in Tokyo, the generals and admirals who still controlled strategy, faced a reality they could not change. They could slow the Americans. They could make them pay in blood for every advance. But they could not stop the Seabees from building the bases that would bring bombers within range of the Japanese homeland. By August 1945, when the atomic bombs fell, Japan's strategic position was hopeless not because of those weapons alone, but because of the entire system of bases, supply lines, and operational infrastructure that American engineering had created. The Seabees had built the platform from which that final blow was delivered. The men of the 121st Battalion finished their work on Tinian in June 1945. They had been in combat for a year and a half, from Oinama through Saipan to Tinian. 7 to 9 Seabees from the battalion were killed or died from wounds during that period. Hundreds more were wounded. They received the Presidential Unit Citation for their service, one of the highest honors a military unit can receive. The citation recognized not just their construction work but their performance in combat, their courage under fire, their willingness to fight as infantry when the situation demanded it. Because that was the other thing about the Seabees that surprised everyone, including the Japanese. They could build. And they could fight. The dual capability made them invaluable. When the Marines needed engineers to blow obstacles, the Seabees were there. When the Army needed roads built under fire, the Seabees built them. When Japanese forces counterattacked through American lines, the Seabees dropped their tools, picked up their rifles, and fought. This versatility, this ability to transition seamlessly from construction to combat and back again, was unique to the Seabees. No other military force in the world had created a unit quite like them. The Soviet Union had construction battalions, but they were poorly equipped and often used as expendable labor. The British had Royal Engineers, highly professional and effective, but organized differently, less flexible in application. The Germans had engineering units that performed well, but they were always limited by resource shortages and could never match American production capacity. The Seabees were an American creation, born from American industrial culture, shaped by American military pragmatism, and employed with a ruthlessness that belied their construction worker origins. They were, in many ways, the perfect embodiment of how America fought the Second World War. Not with elegance or tactical brilliance, but with overwhelming material superiority applied relentlessly until the enemy broke. After the war, the Seabees continued to serve. They built bases during the Cold War. They deployed to Korea and Vietnam. They participated in humanitarian operations after natural disasters. But their greatest achievement, the work that defined them and proved their concept, happened in the Pacific between 1942 and 1945. They built the road to Tokyo. They did it one runway at a time, one fuel depot, one harbor facility, always moving forward, always building, never stopping even when men died and equipment failed and the enemy fought back. The Seabees' motto, "Can do," was not bravado. It was a statement of fact. Tell them what you needed built, and they would build it. Tell them how fast you needed it, and they would finish faster. Tell them it was impossible, and they would do it anyway. On Saipan, in June 1944, when the 121st Battalion made Aslito Airfield operational in 2 days, they were not attempting the impossible. They were doing their job. The job was impossible. They did it anyway. The Japanese watched in disbelief. They had built that airfield over 7 years. The Americans fixed it in 48 hours and used it to attack the next island. This was not a battle decided by tactics or courage. This was a battle decided by engineering. And the engineers who won it were 37-year-old construction workers from America who had crossed an ocean to build the bases that would end the war. They succeeded because they understood something fundamental about modern warfare. Wars are not won by armies alone. They are won by the infrastructure that supports those armies. Supply lines, fuel depots, repair facilities, hospitals, communication networks, and above all, airfields. Control the airfields, and you control the air. Control the air, and you control the battlefield. The Seabees controlled the airfields. They built them faster than the enemy could destroy them, rebuilt them faster than the enemy could believe, and used them to project power that the enemy could not counter. This was the lesson of Aslito Airfield. This was the lesson of Tinian. This was the lesson the Japanese learned too late. You cannot fight a war without logistics. And you cannot win a war when your enemy can build logistics infrastructure faster than you can destroy it. The 500 American engineers who built an airfield in 3 days were not performing a miracle. They were executing a plan developed over years of experience, refined through trial and error, and implemented with professional competence. But to the Japanese watching it happen, it looked like magic. Impossible magic that turned the tide of the Pacific War. If this video helped you understand a lesser-known story from World War II, please consider liking it and sharing it with someone who appreciates military history. Subscribe to this channel to stay updated on more stories from the war that shaped our world. And leave a comment below letting us know what other untold stories from the Pacific Theater you would like us to explore. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is not just about the battles. It is about the people who made victory possible. The Seabees were those people.